Here's what they're not telling you. On the night of April 15th into the 16th, Russia launched what independent analysts are now calling the largest and deadliest air attack on Ukraine in 2026. 44 missiles out Tansir and Is and so in enters and B, including 24 ballistic missiles fired from Iskander systems for Audi, along with 659 attack drones rained down across Ukrainian territory in a single coordinated salvo. That number, 24 Iskanders, deserves your full attention because this isn't just a military statistic, it is a signal. It tells you something very precise about where this war is heading and what the people running it actually believe about the outcome. So you see, Russia is now producing at least 2 Iskander ballistic missiles per day. Experts say possibly 3 or 4. Moscow is drawing 20,000 troops from strategic reserves, bringing its total force in Ukraine to roughly 680,000 soldiers, while producing around 60 Iskander missiles a month. And here is the part that should make every thinking American stop and reconsider the entire narrative they've been fed. Russia has modernized these missiles so that each one can now release radar decoys during final approach, specifically designed to confuse and defeat Patriot air defense systems. The most expensive, most advanced air defense America has ever exported. Spain is being systematically outmaneuvered. As of April 24th, 2026, Russia completed preparations for what intelligence sources describe as a coming massive strike, up to 800 drones, Kinjals, Kh-101 cruise missiles, Zircons, and another wave of up to 24 Iskander ballistic missiles, with Kyiv and western Ukraine listed as primary targets. So ask yourself, ask yourselves, what does a country that is supposedly losing a war look like? Because this doesn't look like losing. This looks like escalation on a timetable, and that timetable should concern every single one of us. Now, before we go any further, I want you to understand something about the Iskander missile that almost nobody in mainstream American media actually bothers to explain. This isn't just another rocket. The Iskander M fires missiles that travel between 500 and 700 kilometers, carry warheads weighing roughly 500 kilograms, and reach speeds of around 9,000 kilometers per hour. To put that in terms everyone can feel, at that speed, by the time your air defense radar has identified the incoming missile, calculated its trajectory, and attempted to fire an interceptor, you are already dealing with a crater. And Russia just fired 24 of them in a single night. Not 1, not 3. 24 ballistic missiles, all in a coordinated salvo, combined with hundreds of drones targeting Ukrainian infrastructure across multiple regions simultaneously. That is not a military skirmish. That is a statement of intent. That is Russia saying loudly and clearly to everyone watching, we are not slowing down. And the timing of this attack, the fact that it happened right now in April of 2026, tells you something absolutely critical about where this war actually stands, something the headlines won't give you because the headlines are always chasing the moment rather than the pattern beneath the moment. Ukrainian military intelligence told the Financial Times that Russia is intensifying ballistic missile strikes as it prepares a new ground offensive in southeast Ukraine with the objective of capturing all of Donbass by September. That's the timeline Moscow is working toward. They're not sitting at negotiating tables waiting for a phone call from Washington to give them permission to stop fighting. They are drawing up operational deadlines, moving troops, and lobbing 24 Iskander missiles into the night to soften targets and suppress Ukrainian defenses ahead of a major ground push. Moscow is pulling 20,000 troops from strategic reserves, bringing its total force in Ukraine to roughly 680,000 soldiers. Let that number sink in for a moment. 680,000 soldiers, that is not a force structure you build when you are contemplating a ceasefire. That is a force structure you build when you intend to win militarily on your terms, on your timetable, and so let's talk about what's actually happening on the ground right now, because the picture is sobering. Over just a single 24-hour period this week, 231 combat engagements were recorded, with Russian forces carrying out 78 airstrikes, dropping 287 guided aerial bombs, deploying more than 7,000 kamikaze drones, and conducting 2,010 shelling attacks on populated areas and Ukrainian military positions. Think about what that number means for the people on the ground. 7,000 drones in a single day. That is an industrial scale operation. That is a country that has converted its entire economic and manufacturing apparatus into a machine of war, and it is running that machine at full output every single day. Meanwhile, in Washington, Washington, people are debating whether to send a few $100 million in aid or not. The asymmetry of political will and industrial capacity between the two sides of this conflict is one of the most important and underreported stories of our time. Now, here's the part that really gets under my skin, and I think it should get under yours too. For the better part of a year, we've been watching diplomatic theater at the highest levels. Trump came into office in January 2025, promising he'd end the war in 24 hours. He has been unable to fulfill that promise. What followed was a dizzying series of summits, envoy trips, phone calls, and leaked frameworks, none of which produced a single day of genuine peace. Trump's administration formulated peace plans generally favorable toward Russia, but these offers were met with refusal from both sides. Russia refused because it believed it was winning on the battlefield and saw no reason to lock in a frozen outcome when a decisive one was still within reach. Ukraine refused because accepting Russia's terms would mean surrendering sovereignty over territory it legally owns and giving Moscow a permanent veto over its national future. And then came the partial energy infrastructure ceasefire in March 2026, which lasted about as long as you'd expect. Both sides accused each other of violations almost immediately. Russia said Ukraine was striking Bryansk and Kursk. Ukraine said Russia never actually stopped hitting civilian infrastructure. Ukraine accused Russia of striking civilian infrastructure almost every night since March 18th, with 8 confirmed strikes against energy infrastructure. The ceasefire was less a pause in hostilities and more a diplomatic fiction. Any something to point to in a press release while the war continued exactly as before, and this April 15th salvo of 24 Iskander missiles proves beyond any reasonable doubt that the fiction has fully collapsed. Russia isn't pretending anymore. The gloves are off, the calendar is set, and the offensive clock is ticking. What I find most revealing in and most troubling is the evolution of the Iskander missile itself as a weapon system in this conflict, because it tells you everything about where Russian military thinking has gone. Ukraine's Air Force warned that Russia has modernized these missiles so that each one can now release radar decoys during final approach, specifically engineered to confuse and defeat Patriot missile defense systems. The Patriot is America's most advanced, most expensive, most celebrated export-grade air defense platform. It was supposed to be the answer, and Moscow spent its engineering resources is quietly, methodically figuring out how to make it irrelevant. According to a report by the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, Russia upgraded the Iskander and Kinzhal missiles with a terminal phase maneuvering capability in spring 2025, specifically to bypass Patriot systems. A Financial Times article from October 2025 noted that interception rates dropped from 37% in August to just 6% in September. 6%? That means 94 out of every 100 upgraded Iskander missiles that Russia fires are reaching their targets. When you understand that number, the true horror of a 24-missile salvo becomes apparent in a way that no headline can fully convey. And now Russia is producing at minimum 2 Iskander missiles per day, possibly 3 or 4. Which means Moscow is generating at least 60 of these weapons every single month. They can fire 24 in a night and still be ahead of their production schedule by morning. This is not a country running out of weapons. This is a country running its defense industry the way America ran its factories during World War II. So completely, urgently, at the absolute maximum of its industrial capacity. And the contrast with the Western response couldn't be starker. The latest National Defense Authorization Act included just $400 million for Ukraine's security assistance for 2026 and 2027 combined, compared to nearly $14 billion in a single supplemental package just 2 years earlier. 2 years ago, America was sending $14 billion in a single bill. Today, the full year commitment is $400 million. That is a reduction of roughly 97%. You can dress that up in whatever strategic language you like, but the practical effect on the battlefield is unmistakable. Ukraine is trying to fight a 2026 war on a 2020 budget. This is where the geopolitical picture becomes genuinely complex, because the United States hasn't simply stepped back from funding Ukraine. It has done so while simultaneously pursuing a diplomatic track that, to put it plainly, has not produced results. What became known as the Trump plan included freezing the front lines, U.S. legal recognition of Russia's status in Crimea, de facto acceptance of other Russian territorial gains in Ukraine, a ban on Ukraine's NATO membership, and the lifting of U.S. sanctions on Russia. Read that list carefully. Every single item on it is something Moscow has demanded since 2022. The United States, under this framework, wasn't mediating between two parties. It was presenting Ukraine with Moscow's wish list and asking Kyiv to sign it. Ukraine declined, as any sovereign nation would, and Russia, sensing the leverage this gave them, simply continued fighting and escalating, knowing that time was on their side as long as Western support remained uncertain and fragmented. Europe has been trying to fill the gap, but it is a genuinely difficult task. Ukraine's defense assistance in 2025 reached a record, with European countries providing roughly 38 billion, while the United States stepped back from new aid allocations almost entirely. Europe is stepping up, there's no question about that. Britain and France are leading a so-called coalition of the willing, drawing up plans for military hubs inside Ukraine should a ceasefire ever materialize. Prime Minister Starmer said that in the event of a ceasefire, the UK and France would establish military hubs across Ukraine and build protected facilities for weapons and military equipment to support Ukraine's defensive needs. These are serious commitments from serious governments, but the brutal reality is that Europe's capacity, while growing, cannot yet match the scale of what the United States withdrew. The gap in Patriot missile interceptors alone, the one system that can theoretically stop an Iskander, is is critically acute, and Ukrainians say they urgently need additional missiles for Patriot batteries to defend against escalating Russian airstrikes. Every day that shortage exists, every day those launchers sit without interceptors, is another day 24 Iskanders can fly largely unopposed. And here's the deeper question I keep coming back to, the one that actually matters when you strip away all the political noise and look at what's happening from a purely analytical standpoint. What does Russia actually want from all of this, and is it achievable? Because the answer to that question determines everything. If Moscow wants a negotiated settlement on favorable terms, escalating strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure ahead of peace talks is a rational, if brutal, way to maximize bargaining leverage. But if Moscow wants military victory, the the complete subjugation of Ukraine's eastern and southern territories and the permanent removal of Kyiv's ability to align with the West, then these Iskander salvos aren't leverage. They're preparation. They're the artillery barrage before the infantry moves. And everything we're seeing, the troop buildup, the September offensive timeline, the missile production surge, the drone saturation campaigns, points much more convincingly toward the second interpretation than the first. Russia's perception that it is winning on the battlefield has left many skeptical that it will agree to any revised peace terms. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said Russia would not compromise in any form on its territorial demands. That's not diplomatic posturing. That's a policy statement. And when a nuclear-armed military power with 680,000 troops in the field producing 60 Iskanders a month fires 24 of them in a single night, you have to take that policy statement seriously, no matter how uncomfortable it makes you feel. What I want Americans to understand, particularly those of you who are trying to make sense of this conflict outside the filter of cable news, is that this war is not a local dispute about borders. It is a test of the entire post-1945 international order. It is a direct question of whether military conquest of a sovereign democracy is permissible in the 21st century, and of what the consequences are for the global system if the answer turns out to be yes. Because if Russia achieves its territorial objectives in Ukraine through force without meaningful cost, then every authoritarian government on earth is watching and learning. They are cataloging what worked and what didn't. So, they are noting that a combination of patience, industrial output, escalation management, and political fracturing inside the opposing coalition is a viable strategy for reversing the outcomes of the post-Cold War era. That is the real stakes of what happened on the night of April 15th, 2026, not just the 24 missiles, not just the 659 drones, not just the craters in Ukrainian soil, but what it means for the world the rest of us are going to have to live in. And that is a conversation America needs to be having right now, with clear eyes, real information, and a willingness to face what the evidence is actually showing us.